Chapter 2, Unit 2, Supply and Demand. 2.1 Demand. What demand actually means. Let's start by getting one thing crystal clear, because the College Board will absolutely test you on this. Demand is not the same as want. You might want a Ferrari, but do you demand one? In economics, demand means the willingness and the ability to pay for a good or service at various prices. That second part, ability to pay, is doing a lot of heavy lifting. When economists talk about demand, they mean buyers who are actually in the market, cash in hand, ready to make a decision. Keep that definition sharp, because on the FRQ, if you write demand is how much someone wants something, you will not get that point. Now, demand is a relationship, not a single number. Think of it this way. Imagine you're at a pizza shop, and someone asks, how much pizza will students buy? The honest answer is, well, it depends on the price. At $5 a slice, maybe you buy 2. At $10, maybe just 1. At $2, maybe 4. That entire collection of price-quantity relationships is what we call the demand schedule, a table showing the quantity demanded at each possible price. When you plot those points on a graph and connect them, you get the demand curve. Drawing and interpreting the demand curve. Here's how to draw a demand curve correctly every single time on the AP exam. Put price on the vertical axis, label it P, and quantity on the horizontal axis, label it Q. Always label both axes and always label the curve itself with a D. Your demand curve slopes downward from left to right. And that slope isn't just a drawing convention. It reflects one of the most fundamental ideas in all of economics, the law of demand, which states that, all else equal, when the price of a good rises, the quantity demanded falls, and when price falls, quantity demanded rises. Price and quantity demanded move in opposite directions. Why does this happen? There are 2 reasons you should be able to articulate. First, the substitution effect. When the price of coffee rises, it becomes relatively more expensive compared to tea, so you substitute toward tea. Second, the income effect. When price rises, your purchasing power effectively falls even if your paycheck hasn't changed. You feel poorer, so you buy less. Both effects push quantity demanded in the same direction, reinforcing the downward slope. Movements along the curve versus shifts of the curve, the biggest trap on the exam. This is the #1 source of lost points on both the MCQ and FRQ sections, so listen very carefully. There are 2 completely different things that can happen involving a demand curve, and mixing them up is a 5-point disaster. A change in quantity demanded is a movement along the existing demand curve caused only by a change in the price of that good. If pizza prices fall and students buy more pizza, you slide down the same curve. The curve itself does not move. On a graph, you'd show this with an arrow moving along the curve to a new point. A change in demand is a shift of the entire curve. The whole thing moves left or right, and it is caused by anything other than the price of the good itself. These non-price determinants are sometimes called the PRITs, a handy acronym: prices of related goods, income, preferences, and tastes, number of buyers, population, expectations of future prices, related goods which overlaps, and beyond that, taxes and subsidies on consumers. Let's unpack the critical ones. Income works differently depending on the type of good. For a normal good, think steak dinners or new cars. When income rises, demand increases. Curve shifts, right? For an inferior good, think instant ramen or bus rides. When income rises, demand actually decreases because people can now afford better alternatives. The AP exam loves to give you a scenario about income changing and ask you to determine the shift direction. Your first question should always be, is this a normal good or an inferior good? Prices of related goods split into 2 categories. Substitute goods are goods consumed instead of each other. Coke and Pepsi, for example. If the price of Coke rises, demand for Pepsi increases, shifts right, because consumers switch over. Complementary goods are consumed together, hot dogs and hot dog buns. If the price of hot dogs rises, people buy fewer hot dogs, and since they need fewer buns, demand for buns decreases, shifts left. The exam will absolutely give you a scenario about complements or substitutes, so make sure you can trace the logic in both directions. Expectations are sneaky. If consumers expect the price of gasoline to rise significantly next week, demand for gasoline today increases. People fill up their tanks now. Future price expectations shift current demand. The demand curve on a graph shifts in practice. When demand increases, the entire curve shifts to the right, Economists sometimes say it shifts out at any given price. Buyers want more. When demand decreases, the curve shifts to the left, or in. On your AP exam diagram, you must draw the original curve labeled D1 and the new curve labeled D2, with an arrow showing the direction of the shift. Failing to label both curves is a common reason. Students lose FRQ points even when their logic is correct. Edge cases worth knowing. A few boundary conditions show up repeatedly on the MCQ. First, a perfectly vertical demand curve, called perfectly inelastic demand, means quantity demanded doesn't change at all, regardless of price. Think life-saving insulin for a diabetic patient. Second, a perfectly horizontal demand curve. Perfectly elastic demand means consumers will buy any amount at one specific price but zero at any higher price. These are covered more deeply in Unit 2.3 on elasticity, but you'll want to recognize these shapes when you see them. Also, watch out for the difference between individual demand and market demand. Market demand is simply the horizontal summation of all individual demand curves. You add up the quantities each consumer would buy at each price. If a new demographic of buyers enters the market, market demand shifts right, even if no individual's preferences changed. Connections across units. Demand doesn't live in isolation. In Unit 2, you'll immediately connect it to supply to find equilibrium. In Unit 3, demand curves reappear inside the theory of consumer choice, where you'll use marginal utility to explain why the demand curve slopes downward. In Unit 4 on imperfect competition, firms face their own downward-sloping demand curves and use them to make pricing decisions. And in Unit 5 on factor markets, the demand for labor is actually a derived demand. Firms hire workers because of the demand consumers have for the product those workers produce. Every time demand shows up in a new context, the same core logic applies. With a solid grip on demand, its definition, its curve, the law behind it, and the non-price factors that shift it, you're ready to bring supply into the picture and discover how markets actually find their balance. 2.2 Determinants, shifters of demand. The difference between moving along the curve and moving the whole curve. All right, let's talk about one of the most tested concepts on the entire AP Microeconomics exam, the determinants of demand, or as College Board loves to call them, the shifters of demand. Before we dive in, I want to make sure you have the single most important distinction in this entire unit burned into your brain. There is a fundamental difference between a change in quantity demanded and a change in demand. Get this wrong on the FRQ, and you will lose points that could have been yours. So let's be crystal clear right now. A change in quantity demanded happens when the price of the good itself changes. That's it. Nothing else. When price changes, you move along the existing demand curve, up the curve if price rises, down the curve if price falls. You do not draw a new curve. You simply slide your finger along the one you already have. On a graph, this shows up as movement between 2 points on the same curve, and the correct AP term is a change in quantity demanded. A change in demand, on the other hand, happens when something other than the goods own price changes. This causes the entire demand curve to shift, either to the right, which represents an increase in demand, or to the left, which represents a decrease in demand. When demand increases, the whole curve moves rightward, meaning consumers are now willing and able to buy more at every single price level. When demand decreases, the curve shifts leftward. This is the concept we're focusing on right now, and the factors that cause these shifts are called the determinants, or shifters of demand. The 5 major determinants of demand. College Board expects you to know 5 major categories of demand shifters, and I want you to think of them with the classic mnemonic tribe: tastes, related goods prices, income, buyers, number of, and expectations. Let's walk through each one like we're sitting across from each other at that coffee shop. Tastes and preferences are exactly what they sound like. If consumers suddenly decide they love a product more, maybe a celebrity endorses it, or a health study comes out praising it, or it just becomes trendy, demand increases and the curve shifts, right? Think about what happened to oat milk a few years ago. Nobody was drinking it, and then suddenly it was everywhere. A positive shift in consumer preferences caused demand to surge. The reverse works too. If a product falls out of fashion or gets bad press, demand falls and the curve shifts left. No price change happened. Consumers just changed their minds. Related goods prices require you to understand 2 subcategories: substitutes and complements. A substitute is a good that can replace another. Think Pepsi and Coke, or butter and margarine. If the price of Pepsi rises, some consumers will switch to Coke. So the demand for Coke increases, the Coke demand curve shifts, right? Here's the rule to memorize. For substitutes, price and demand move in the same direction. If price of the substitute goes up, demand for your good goes up. If price of the substitute goes down, demand for your good goes down. A complement is a good consumed together with another, like hot dogs and hot dog buns, or printers and ink cartridges. If the price of printers rises, fewer people buy printers, and therefore fewer people need ink cartridges, so the demand for ink cartridges decreases, shifts left. The rule for complements is the opposite price of the complement and demand for your good move in opposite directions. This distinction between substitutes and complements is one of the most common MCQ trap areas, so tattoo those two rules onto your brain. Income is where you need to understand the difference between normal goods and inferior goods. Another concept AP loves to test. For a normal good, when consumer income rises, demand increases. Think steak, gym memberships, or new cars. When you earn more money, you buy more of these. But for an inferior good, the relationship flips. When income rises, demand decreases. Examples include instant ramen, bus rides, or generic store brand products. When people get raises, they stop buying the cheap stuff and trade up. Here's the classic MCQ trap. The word inferior does not mean the product is bad quality. It's a technical economic term meaning demand moves inversely with income. A very comfortable bus system can still be an inferior good in the economic sense. Buyers. The number of consumers in the market is straightforward. More buyers, more demand. If a city's population grows, demand for local goods increases and curves shift, right? If a target demographic shrinks, demand falls. This also connects to market size concepts you'll see again when we discuss market structures later in the course. Expectations about future prices, income, or availability can shift current demand today. If you expect the price of gasoline to spike next week, you fill up your tank today, increasing current demand now. If you expect to lose your job, you cut spending today, decreasing current demand. Expectations show up in a sneaky way on the FRQ. Students sometimes forget that what consumers anticipate about the future affects what they do in the present. Drawing the graph correctly. When you draw a demand shift on an FRQ, here's exactly what College Board wants to see. Start with a properly labeled graph. Price on the vertical axis labeled P, quantity on the horizontal axis labeled Q, and a downward sloping demand curve clearly labeled D1. When demand increases, draw a new downward sloping curve to the right of the original and label it D2. When demand decreases, draw D2 to the left. Do not just erase and redraw. Show both curves clearly, with an arrow indicating the direction of the shift. Failure to label curves or axes costs rubric points every single time. Connecting forward. This entire section links directly to what's coming next. Once you understand what shifts the demand curve, you'll be able to analyze how those shifts interact with supply to determine new equilibrium prices and quantities, which is the heart of Chapter 2.3, and every single market analysis question on this exam. 2.3 Supply. What supply actually means. Let's start with something that trips up a surprising number of students right out of the gate. Supply is not the same as quantity supplied. I know that sounds like splitting hairs, but on the AP exam, confusing these two ideas will cost you points, guaranteed. Supply refers to the entire relationship between price and how much producers are willing and able to offer for sale. It's the whole schedule, the whole curve. Quantity supplied, on the other hand, is a single point on that curve, the specific amount producers will offer at one particular price. Keep that distinction locked in your memory because we'll come back to it. Now, the law of supply states that, all else equal, as the price of a good rises, the quantity supplied rises, and as the price falls, the quantity supplied falls. This is a positive relationship. Price and quantity supplied move in the same direction. Think about it from a producer's perspective. If the price of artisan coffee suddenly doubled, you'd expect coffee shops to hire more baristas, buy more beans, stay open longer, because higher prices mean higher potential profit, which means more incentive to produce. That's the law of supply in action. Drawing and labeling the supply curve. For the AP exam, you absolutely must be able to draw a supply curve correctly. Here's how. Draw a standard 2-axis graph with price on the vertical axis, labeled P, and quantity on the horizontal axis, labeled Q. Your supply curve, labeled S, slopes upward from left to right. That positive slope reflects the law of supply. Always label your axes. Always label the curve. On the FRQ, graders are looking for those labels, and a beautifully drawn graph with no labels gets you 0 credit for the graph. Now here's the critical distinction that the AP exam tests constantly. the difference between a movement along the supply curve and a shift of the supply curve itself. A change in price causes a movement along the curve, sliding from one point to another. This is called a change in quantity supplied. But when something other than price changes, the entire curve shifts. That's called a change in supply. A rightward shift means supply has increased. Producers are willing to offer more at every price level. A leftward shift means supply has decreased. The shifters of supply, the referent factors. Think of supply shifters as the forces that can pick up your entire supply curve and move it. The College Board expects you to know all of them, and they show up relentlessly on multiple choice questions. A helpful way to remember them is through categories: input prices, technology, number of sellers, expectations, government policies, taxes and subsidies, and prices of related goods in production. Input prices are huge. If the cost of steel rises, car manufacturers face higher production costs and will supply fewer cars at every price. The curve shifts left. Flip it. If labor costs fall, supply increases and the curve shifts right. Technology improvements reduce production costs and increase supply, shifting the curve rightward. Think about how automation has transformed manufacturing over the decades. More sellers in a market increases market supply, shifting the curve right. Expectations matter too. If a wheat farmer expects prices to be much higher next month, they might withhold supply now, temporarily decreasing current supply. Government policies are a favorite AP trap. A per-unit tax on producers increases their cost of production, which decreases supply and shifts the curve left. A subsidy, on the other hand, effectively lowers production costs and increases supply, shifting the curve right. Students often confuse which way these shift the curve, so practice drawing both scenarios explicitly. Finally, prices of related goods in production, specifically substitutes and complements in production. These are not the same as the substitutes and complements you'll study on the demand side, and mixing them up is a classic MCQ trap. If corn and soybeans can both be grown on the same land, they're substitutes in production. If the price of soybeans rises, farmers might shift acreage to soybeans, decreasing the supply of corn. Joint products, goods produced together like beef and leather, are complements in production. If beef prices rise, more cattle are processed, and leather supply increases as a byproduct. Price elasticity of supply. The AP exam also expects you to understand price elasticity of supply, how responsive quantity supplied is to price changes. The formula is the same intuitive structure as demand elasticity, percentage change in quantity supplied divided by percentage change in price. Because of the law of supply, this value is always positive. Elastic supply, elasticity greater than 1, means producers can ramp up or cut back production relatively easily in response to price changes. Think digital downloads, where one more copy costs almost nothing to produce. Inelastic supply, elasticity less than 1, means supply is relatively unresponsive. Think original Picasso paintings, where no price increase can produce more of them. A perfectly inelastic supply curve is a vertical line, meaning quantity supplied doesn't change at all regardless of price. A perfectly elastic supply curve is horizontal. The key determinant of supply elasticity is time. In the short run, supply tends to be more inelastic because producers can't quickly change their factory capacity or hire specialized workers. In the long run, supply becomes more elastic as all inputs become variable. This time dimension connects directly to Unit 3 when you study production and costs, so hold on to it. Common MCQ traps and FRQ precision. Here are the traps you need to sidestep. First, never say the supply curve shifts in response to a price change. Price changes move you along the curve. Second, watch for questions that describe a change and ask whether supply or quantity supplied changed. Commit the rule: price, quantity supplied, movement. Anything else? Supply, shift. Third, students frequently draw the supply shift in the wrong direction when taxes are involved. Remember, a tax on producers raises their costs and shifts supply left, raising equilibrium price and lowering equilibrium quantity. On the FRQ, the graders want precision. Don't write supply increases. Write the supply of X increases, shifting the supply curve to the right. Show the new curve on your graph, label it S2, and identify the new equilibrium. That level of precision is what earns you full rubric points. Connecting forward, supply in isolation only tells half the story. Once we combine supply with demand, you'll see how markets actually find equilibrium prices and quantities, which is exactly where we're headed next in Section 2.4. 2.4 Determinants, shifters of supply. Let's talk about supply, specifically what makes it move. You already know that the supply curve shows the relationship between price and quantity supplied, holding everything else constant. That phrase, holding everything else constant, is the key to this entire section. Because when those everything else factors change, the whole curve shifts. And that shift is exactly what this topic is about. Think of the supply curve as a snapshot of a producer's behavior on a given day. It's drawn under a specific set of conditions. Change those conditions, and you're not moving along the curve anymore. You're drawing an entirely new curve. This distinction is one of the most tested ideas on the AP exam, so let's make sure it's crystal clear in your mind before we go any further. The crucial distinction: movement versus shift. Here's the trap College Board sets again and again. A change in price causes a change in quantity supplied. That's a movement along the existing supply curve. But a change in anything other than the good's own price causes a shift of the entire supply curve. When supply increases, the curve shifts to the right. When supply decreases, it shifts to the left. On your FRQ, you need to draw this correctly and label it. Draw your original supply curve, S1, then draw the new curve S2 either to the right, increase, or left, decrease, and always label both curves and the axes, price on the vertical, quantity on the horizontal. A helpful way to remember direction: an increase in supply means producers are willing and able to supply more at every price, so the curve moves outward to the right. Think of it as the curve expanding toward more quantity. The 6 key shifters of supply. Now, let's walk through each determinant. Think of the acronym ROTTEN, though on the AP exam, College Board typically organizes these as input prices, technology, number of sellers, expectations, government actions, taxes, subsidies, regulations, and prices of related goods in production. Let's make each one vivid. Input prices are the costs a producer pays to make the product: wages, raw materials, energy, rent. Imagine you run a pizza shop. If mozzarella cheese suddenly doubles in price, your cost of production rises, and you'll supply fewer pizzas at every price level. The supply curve shifts left. Conversely, if oil prices drop and your delivery costs fall, supply shifts right. This is the most commonly tested shifter on both MCQs and FRQs, so burn this one into your memory. Technology is essentially anything that makes production more efficient. A better oven that bakes twice as many pizzas in the same time is a technological improvement. It lowers your cost per unit, so you're willing to supply more at every price. Technology shifts supply to the right almost always. You will never see a question where improved technology shifts supply left. That's a trap you can avoid confidently. Number of sellers or producers in the market works exactly as you'd expect. More sellers means more total supply. The market supply curve shifts right. If half the pizza shops in town close, market supply shifts left. This is simply an aggregation point. Market supply is the horizontal summation of all individual supply curves. Expectations about future prices influence current supply decisions. If producers expect the price of their product to rise in the future, they may withhold current supply, storing inventory now to sell later at a higher price. This is a subtle point that appears on MCQs. A wheat farmer who expects wheat prices to spike next month might supply less wheat today, shifting supply left now. This counterintuitive logic trips up many students. Government actions come in 3 flavors: taxes, subsidies, and regulations. A per-unit tax on production increases the producer's cost and shifts supply left. It's as if input prices went up. A government subsidy does the opposite. It effectively lowers the cost of production and shifts supply right. Regulations, such as environmental compliance requirements, typically raise costs and shift supply left. When you see any of these in a free response prompt, identify them clearly and explain the cost mechanism before drawing your shift. Prices of related goods in production. And this is when students confuse with the demand side concept of substitutes and complement. On the supply side, these are goods in production, not goods in consumption. If corn and soybeans can both be grown on the same land, they're substitutes in production. If the price of soybeans rises, farmers will shift their acreage toward soybeans, reducing the supply of corn. Alternatively, some goods are complements in production. They're jointly produced. Beef and leather come from the same animal. If demand for beef rises and beef producers slaughter more cattle, the supply of leather increases automatically. This complementary production relationship is a favorite MCQ edge case. Graph mastery for the FRQ. On any free response question involving a supply shift, you need to execute this flawlessly. Draw a correctly labeled supply and demand graph with price on the vertical axis and quantity on the horizontal. Label equilibrium point E1 with corresponding P1 and Q1. Then show the shift. Draw S2 either right or left of S1 and label the new equilibrium E2 with P2 and Q2. Trace the dotted lines from the new equilibrium to both axes. If the question asks you to identify the direction of change in price and quantity, state it explicitly. The supply decrease shifts S left, raising equilibrium price from P1 to P2 and lowering equilibrium quantity from Q1 to Q2. AP readers are looking for exactly that kind of precise directional language. Common traps to avoid. 2 traps deserve special mention. First, never confuse a change in quantity supplied caused by a price change, movement along the curve, with a change in supply, a shift. This distinction is tested relentlessly. Second, don't mix up the supply side related goods in production shifter with the demand side prices of related goods shifter. They operate through completely different mechanisms. One more. Weather and natural events are sometimes added to this list, especially in agricultural context. A drought decreases the supply of crops. That's a perfectly valid FRQ scenario. Treat it as an input disruption that raises effective costs or physically reduces output. Connections to other units. These supply shifters don't exist in isolation. When supply shifts, equilibrium price and quantity change, which connects directly to your consumer and producer surplus analysis in Unit 2. In Unit 3, when you study market structures, input costs and technology reappear as key determinants of a firm's cost curves. And in Unit 4, when you analyze factor markets, you'll see how changes in wage rates, a major input price, ripple back to shift product supply curves. Everything connects. With the determinants of supply firmly in hand, you're ready to bring supply and demand together in one of the most powerful analytical tools in all of economics, market equilibrium, where these 2 curves finally meet. 2.5 Market equilibrium, disequilibrium, and changes in equilibrium. The meeting point of 2 forces. Imagine you're at a farmer's market, and a vendor is selling handmade hot sauce. She's trying to figure out the right price it too high, and bottles pile up unsold on her table. Price it too low, and she sells out in 20 minutes, leaving dozens of customers empty-handed. Somewhere in the middle is a price where every bottle she's willing to sell finds exactly one willing buyer. That's sweet spot, that's equilibrium, and understanding it deeply, including what happens when the market falls out of equilibrium and how it finds its way back, is one of the most tested concepts on the AP Microeconomics exam. Defining equilibrium. Market equilibrium occurs at the price where quantity demanded equals quantity supplied on your supply and demand graph, which you absolutely must be able to draw from scratch on the FRQ section. Equilibrium is the point where the downward-sloping demand curve and the upward-sloping supply curve intersect. The price at that intersection is called the equilibrium price, sometimes called the market clearing price. And the quantity at that intersection is the equilibrium quantity. Label that intersection point E, drop a dashed horizontal line to the price axis to mark P, and drop a dashed vertical line down to the quantity axis to mark Q college. Board loves to see precise labeling, so never skip those labels. There's no formula for equilibrium beyond the condition QD equals QS, but on quantitative FRQs or MCQs, you may be given demand and supply equations and asked to solve for the equilibrium price and quantity algebraically. If demand is QD equals 100 minus 2P and supply is Q sub S is equals 20 plus 3P, you set them equal. 100 minus 2P equals 20 plus 3P. Solve to get P times equals 16, then plug back in to find Q sub Q times 68. Practice this. It shows up more often than students expect. Disequilibrium, surpluses and shortages. Now here's where the exam loves to test you. When the market is not at equilibrium, you have disequilibrium, and it comes in 2 flavors, surplus and shortage. A surplus, also called excess supply, occurs when the price is above equilibrium. At that higher price, producers want to sell more than consumers want to buy. Think of holiday toys that didn't sell. Suddenly they're 50% off in January. The surplus creates downward pressure on price, pushing it back toward equilibrium. On your graph, a surplus appears as a horizontal gap between the supply curve to the right and the demand curve to the left at the above equilibrium price. The size of that gap is the surplus quantity. A shortage, also called excess demand, occurs when the price is below equilibrium. Now, consumers want more than producers are willing to sell at that price. Think of concert tickets priced below what the market will bear. They're gone in minutes, and people are scalping them for triple the price. Shortages create upward pressure on price. On your graph, the shortage gap runs from the demand curve to the right to the supply curve to the left at the below equilibrium price. The critical decision rule here: surpluses push prices down, shortages push prices up, and in a free market, both forces naturally correct toward equilibrium. This self-correcting mechanism is called the market clearing process, and it's the backbone of competitive market theory. Changes in equilibrium, shifting curves. Here's where students earn or lose the most points. When a determinant of demand or supply changes, not the price itself. Remember, price changes cause movements along curves, not shifts. The entire curve shifts, and equilibrium moves to a new location. When demand increases, shifts right. Both equilibrium price and quantity rise. When demand decreases, shifts left. Both fall. When supply increases, shifts right. Equilibrium price falls, but quantity rises. When supply decreases, shifts left. Price rises, but quantity falls. You need these 4 outcomes memorized cold. The tricky cases, the ones that wreck unprepared students on the MCQ, are the simultaneous shift scenarios. If both supply and demand shift at the same time, one variable becomes indeterminate. If demand increases and supply increases simultaneously, quantity definitely rises. But the effect on price is ambiguous. It depends on the relative magnitude of the shifts. If demand increases and supply decreases simultaneously, price definitely rises. But the effect on quantity is ambiguous. College Board will often tell you the relative size of the shifts to resolve the ambiguity, or they'll ask you to identify which variable is indeterminate. Knowing when to say "it depends" is itself a scoreable skill on the FRQ. When drawing a shift on your graph, always draw the new curve as a distinct labeled curve. Call it D2 or S2. And mark the new equilibrium point, E2, with updated P2 times and Q2 times labels. Never erase your original curves. The comparison between E1 and E2 is exactly what the rubric is checking. Common MCQ traps to watch for. The single most common trap is confusing a change in quantity demanded with a change in demand. If the question says income rose, that shifts the demand curve. That's a change in demand. If the question says price rose, that's a movement along the existing demand curve. That's a change in quantity demanded. No curve shift. No new equilibrium. Read every stimulus carefully for this distinction. Another trap. Students sometimes draw the wrong direction for a supply shift when input costs change. Higher input costs reduce supply, the curve shifts left, price rises, quantity falls. Students intuitively want to say costs went up, so price goes up, so quantity goes up. That's wrong. Higher costs reduce supply, which raises price, but reduces quantity. Connections to other units. This topic threads through the entire course. In Unit 3, when you study consumer and producer surplus, you'll calculate those triangles using the equilibrium point as your reference. In Unit 4, price controls, price ceilings, and price floors are literally government-imposed disequilibrium situations, so your mastery of surpluses and shortages here makes that topic intuitive. In Unit 5, factor markets use the same supply-demand equilibrium framework applied to labor and capital. Every efficiency argument in Unit 4 and beyond rests on the idea that equilibrium maximizes total surplus, a claim that only makes sense once you deeply understand what equilibrium is and why disequilibrium wastes resources. Equilibrium isn't just a graph intersection. It's the organizing principle of how markets allocate resources, which makes it the conceptual heartbeat of the entire AP Microeconomics course. With that foundation locked in, you're ready to explore what happens when markets are deliberately prevented from reaching equilibrium, the world of price controls, coming up next. 2.6 Price elasticity of demand. What elasticity actually means. Imagine you're at a gas station, and the price per gallon jumps by 50 cents overnight. You grimace, you grumble, but you probably still fill up your tank because you need to get to work. Now imagine your favorite streaming service raises its monthly price by 50 cents. You barely notice. But what if a luxury spa you visit occasionally doubles its prices? You might cancel your membership entirely. Same idea, 3 very different reactions. That difference in sensitivity, how dramatically consumers respond to a price change, is exactly what price elasticity of demand measures, and it is one of the most heavily tested concepts on the entire AP Microeconomics exam. Price elasticity of demand, which the College Board abbreviates as PED or simply calls elasticity of demand, measures the responsiveness of quantity demanded to a change in price. The formal definition you need to know cold is this. PED is the percentage change in quantity demanded divided by the percentage change in price. Write this down and memorize it. The formula PED equals percent delta QD divided by percent delta P. Because demand curves slope downward, price goes up, quantity demanded goes down. This calculation always produces a negative number. Here's a critical exam note. The College Board typically uses the absolute value of PED when comparing elasticities, so when your answer comes out negative, just drop the sign and work with the positive number. Some questions will explicitly tell you this, others assume you know it. Calculating elasticity, the midpoint method. The AP exam loves to test your ability to actually calculate PED, and the method you must use is called the midpoint method, sometimes called the arc elasticity formula. Here's why it exists. If you calculate percentage changes using the starting point as your base, you get a different answer than if you use the ending point. The midpoint method eliminates that inconsistency by using the average of the two values as the base. Midpoint method formula. PED equals COBO Q2 minus Q1 divided by Q2 plus Q1 divided by 2 divided by P2 minus P1 covered Your price change is plus $20 and your average price is $50. So your percentage change in price is plus 40%. Divide minus 50% by plus 40% and you get minus 1.25. Drop the sign, PED equals 1.25. You'll use this exact process on FRQ calculations, so practice it until it feels automatic. Interpreting the numbers, the decision rules. Once you have your PED value, you need to interpret it. This is where the exam tests conceptual understanding. If PED is greater than 1, demand is elastic. Consumers are highly responsive to price changes. Think of elastic like a rubber band that stretches dramatically. Designer handbags, vacations, and restaurant meals tend to be elastic because they have substitutes and aren't necessities. If PED is less than 1 time but greater than 0, demand is inelastic. Consumers barely change their behavior when prices shift. Gasoline, insulin, and cigarettes, for addicted smokers, are classic inelastic goods. If PED equals exactly 1, demand is unit elastic, meaning the percentage changes are perfectly equal. 2 important edge cases appear constantly on multiple choice questions. Perfectly, inelastic demand has a PED of 0. Quantity demanded doesn't change at all when price changes. On a graph, this looks like a perfectly vertical demand curve. Think of life-saving medication for which there is no substitute. Perfectly elastic demand has a PED of infinity. Consumers will buy any amount at one specific price, but nothing at all if the price rises even slightly. On a graph, this looks like a perfectly horizontal demand curve. You'll see this appear again in Unit 4 when you study perfect competition, where individual firms face horizontal demand curves. Drawing and reading the graph. For the AP exam, you must be able to sketch these curves accurately. A normal downward-sloping demand curve has varying elasticity along its length. It is more elastic toward the upper left, higher prices, lower quantities, and more inelastic toward the lower right, lower prices, higher quantities. This trips students up constantly. A common MCQ trap is assuming that a steeper demand curve is always more inelastic. Steepness does reflect inelasticity, but only when you're comparing 2 curves at the same point or same price. A flatter curve is more elastic. A steeper curve is more inelastic, but this is a visual shortcut, not an absolute rule. Determinants of elasticity. The exam also expects you to know why some goods are elastic and others aren't. The major determinants are availability of substitutes. The most important, more substitutes means more elastic. Necessity versus luxury. Necessities are inelastic. Proportion of income spent on the good, expensive goods, tend to be more elastic. And time horizon, demand becomes more elastic over time as consumers find alternatives. A question might describe a good and ask you to predict whether demand is elastic or inelastic. Run through these determinants mentally. The connection to total revenue. Here's where elasticity becomes genuinely powerful, and where the AP exam loves to create tricky questions. Total revenue equals price times quantity, TR equals P times Q, and elasticity tells you what happens to total revenue when price changes. If demand is elastic and price rises, total revenue falls, the loss in quantity sold outweighs the gain from the higher price. If demand is inelastic and price rises, total revenue rises. Consumers keep buying despite the price increase. When demand is unit elastic, total revenue doesn't change with price. This is the total revenue test, and it's a shortcut you can use on both MCQs and FRQs. The most common trap here is reversing the relationship. Students often instinctively think that raising prices always raises revenue. It only does when demand is inelastic. This total revenue connection links directly to Unit 3, where you'll analyze how firms with market power like monopolies set prices, and to Unit 4, where perfectly competitive firms face perfectly elastic demand. The concept of elasticity also reappears in Unit 2 itself when you study cross-price elasticity and income elasticity, which use the same percentage change logic applied to different variables. Now that you've mastered how consumers respond to price changes, let's look at how suppliers respond, which brings us to the concept of price elasticity of supply. 2.7 Price elasticity of supply. What is price elasticity of supply? All right, so you've already wrestled with price elasticity of demand. You know how to measure how sensitive buyers are to price changes? Now we're flipping to the other side of the market. Price elasticity of supply asks a beautifully simple question. When the price of a good goes up, how eagerly does the quantity supplied respond? Are producers leaping to action, or are they shrugging their shoulders? Think of it this way. Imagine you own a food truck selling tacos. If taco prices suddenly double tomorrow, how quickly can you make more tacos? Pretty quickly, right? You call your supplier, order more ingredients, maybe work a double shift. Now imagine you're a commercial real estate developer. If office space rental prices double, how quickly can you build more skyscrapers? Months, years, permits, construction, financing? The time and resource constraints producers face are the whole story behind supply elasticity. And that intuition will carry you through every question the AP exam throws at you. The formula. The formula for price elasticity of supply, or PES, mirrors the demand formula almost exactly. You calculate it as the percentage change in quantity supplied divided by the percentage change in price. Written out, PES equals the percent change in quantity supplied over the percent change in price. Since supply curves slope upward, both the numerator and denominator move in the same direction. So PES is always a positive number. No need to take an absolute value here, unlike with demand elasticity. That's actually a detail AP graders love to test. So burn it in. PES is positive. Using the midpoint method for calculations on the AP exam keeps things clean. The midpoint formula tells you to take the change in quantity supplied divided by the average of the two quantities. Then divide that by the change in price divided by the average of the two prices. If you see 2 points on a supply schedule in a free response question and they ask you to calculate PES, the midpoint method is your go-to. Interpreting the number. Once you have your PES value, you interpret it using the same framework as demand. If PES is greater than 1, supply is elastic. Producers are highly responsive, and a small price increase triggers a proportionally larger increase in quantity supplied. If PES is less than 1, supply is inelastic. Producers can't or won't respond much even when prices rise significantly. If PES equals exactly 1, you have unit elastic supply. And then there are the two extreme cases that show up constantly on multiple choice questions. When PES equals 0, supply is perfectly inelastic. No matter what happens to price, quantity supplied stays fixed. Picture original Picasso paintings. There is a finite number of them in the world, and price changes simply cannot conjure more. On a graph, perfectly inelastic supply is a vertical line. Quantity supplied is locked, and the curve stands straight up like a wall. When PES is infinite, supply is perfectly elastic. The supply curve is a horizontal line, meaning producers will supply any quantity at exactly 1 price, but 0 quantity at anything below it. This is a theoretical concept often used to model industries with constant costs and unlimited capacity at that cost. Drawing the graphs, you absolutely need to be able to sketch these. For a typical upward sloping supply curve, label your axes, price on the vertical axis, quantity on the horizontal, and draw a line with a positive slope. If it's elastic, draw it relatively flat, almost lying down. If it's inelastic, draw it steep, almost vertical. Here's a geometric trick that AP teachers love to share. Any straight line supply curve that passes through the origin has a PES of exactly 1, regardless of its slope. Any straight line supply curve that intersects the price axis, that is, it cuts the vertical axis above 0, is elastic everywhere along it. Any straight line supply curve that intersects the quantity axis, cutting the horizontal axis to the right of 0, is inelastic everywhere along it. This is one of the most tested visual traps on the AP exam. Students see a steep supply curve and immediately shout inelastic. But if that steep line passes through the origin, PES equals 1. Slow down and look where the line intersects before you answer. Determinants of price elasticity of supply. The AP exam expects you to explain why supply is more or less elastic, not just calculate it. The biggest determinant is time. In the short run, firms have fixed inputs, factories, equipment, land, and simply cannot change output quickly. Supply tends to be more inelastic. In the long run, firms can adjust all inputs, enter or exit the industry, and build new capacity, so supply becomes more elastic. This short-run versus long-run distinction connects directly to Unit 3, where you'll analyze production costs and the difference between fixed and variable inputs. Availability of inputs matters too. If the resources needed to produce a good are easily accessible and not specialized, producers can ramp up output without facing steeply rising costs, making supply more elastic. Think about printing more copies of a popular book versus mining more rare earth minerals. Ease of storing inventory also plays a role. Goods that can be stockpiled allow producers to respond to price increases more fluidly. Common traps and FRQ precision. Let's talk about the mistakes that cost students points. First, confusing the slope of the supply curve with its elasticity. These are related but not identical. That origin rule mentioned above is the proof. Second, forgetting that PES is always positive. If your calculation comes out negative on a supply question, you've made an arithmetic error somewhere. Third, mixing up perfectly inelastic supply, vertical line, PES equals 0, with perfectly inelastic demand, both are vertical. Both have a PES or PED of 0, but one is on the supply side and one is on the demand side. Keep them sorted by context. On free response questions, if you're asked to explain using price elasticity of supply, the AP rubric is looking for 3 things in your answer: the correct direction of quantity supplied change, an explicit reference to the degree of responsiveness, and a real connection to the reason: time horizon, input availability, or resource constraints. Vague answers like supply goes up a little earn nothing. Precise answers that name the elasticity concept and explain why earn full marks. Connections to other topics. Price elasticity of supply weaves through the rest of your AP course in important ways. When you study tax incidence in Unit 2, the relative elasticities of supply and demand determine who actually bears the burden of a tax, a concept that only makes sense if you understand elasticity deeply. In Unit 3, your understanding of fixed versus variable inputs maps directly onto why supply is inelastic in the short run and elastic in the long run. And in Unit 4, when you analyze different market structures, elasticity of supply helps explain why competitive industries respond to profit signals so differently than monopolies. With supply elasticity now in your toolkit alongside demand elasticity, you're ready to put both sides of the market together and explore what happens when governments decide to intervene. So let's head into price controls and the fascinating real-world consequences they create. 2.8 Other elasticities: income and cross-price elasticity. The bigger picture, elasticity beyond price. So far in Unit 2, you've mastered own price elasticity, how consumers respond when the price of a good changes. But here's the thing: prices aren't the only thing that shifts demand. Your income changes, the price of a related good changes. And when those things happen, economists have precise tools to measure exactly how demand responds. That's what income elasticity and cross-price elasticity are all about. And the AP exam loves to test both of them, not just conceptually, but with calculations and interpretation. Let's dig in. Income elasticity of demand. Imagine you just got a big raise. You're suddenly buying better cuts of steak, flying instead of driving, maybe picking up a gym membership. But you're probably buying fewer ramen packets and skipping the discount store. That intuition, that income changes affect what and how much we buy, is exactly what income elasticity of demand captures. The formula is straightforward. Income elasticity of demand, YED, equals percent change in quantity demanded divided by change in income. Just like with own price elasticity, you're building a ratio. If income rises by 10% and quantity demanded of ribeye steaks rises by 20%, your YED is plus 2.0. That positive sign is doing a lot of work here. The sign of income elasticity tells you what type of good you're dealing with. And this is the core classification the AP exam tests obsessively. A positive YED means the good is a normal good. As income rises, you buy more of it. Most goods fall into this category. A negative YED means the good is an inferior good. As income rises, you actually buy less of it because you can now afford something better. Ramen noodles, used clothing, bus passes, classic inferior goods. When income goes up, quantity demanded goes down, giving you that negative ratio. But wait, College Board also distinguishes between two subcategories of normal goods, and this shows up on FRQs. If YED is positive, but less than 1 between 0 and 1, the good is a necessity, think basic groceries or utilities. Demand grows with income, but not dramatically. If YED is greater than 1, the good is a luxury. Demand grows faster than income grows. Think vacations, designer clothes, sports cars. A 10% income increase might cause a 25% jump in demand for luxury handbags. That YED of 2.5 screams luxury. Memorize this decision rule. Negative YED equals inferior good. YED between 0 and 1 equals normal necessity. YED greater than 1 is equals normal luxury. On the graph side, income elasticity doesn't have its own unique diagram, the way supply and demand curves do. But you need to understand how it connects to demand curve shifts. When income rises and YED is positive, the entire demand curve shifts rightward. More is demanded at every price. When income rises and YED is negative, inferior good, the demand curve shifts left. This is a critical link back to Unit 2's demand shifters. On an FRQ, if you're told a good is inferior and incomes are rising, you must show the demand curve shifting left, not right. Getting that direction wrong costs you rubric points. Cross-price elasticity of demand. Now, let's say you don't care about income. You're focused on related goods. When the price of gasoline skyrockets, what happens to the demand for electric vehicles? When the price of Netflix goes up, do people subscribe to Hulu more? Cross-price elasticity of demand measures exactly this relationship. The formula? Cross-price elasticity of demand, XED, equals percent change in quantity, demanded of good, A divided by percent change in price of good B. Notice you're crossing two different goods. The quantity of one responds to the price of another. That cross is in the name for a reason. Again, the sign is everything. A positive XED means the goods are substitutes. When the price of good B rises, consumers switch to good A, so quantity demanded of A increases. Coffee and tea are classic substitutes. If coffee prices spike, XED for tea is positive because tea demand rises. A negative XED means the goods are complements. When the price of good B rises, people buy less of B, and since A is used together with B, they buy less of A too. Printers and ink cartridges. Hot dogs and hot dog buns. If printer prices rise, demand for ink falls negative XED. And what if XED is exactly 0? The goods are unrelated or independent. The price of one has no measurable effect on the quantity demanded of the other. Think printer prices and banana demand. This boundary condition appears on MCQs more than you'd expect. The magnitude of XED also matters. A large positive number suggests goods are very close substitutes. Pepsi and Coca-Cola might have a very high positive XED because they're nearly interchangeable. A small positive number suggests weak substitutes. Same logic applies to complements. A larger negative number means more tightly linked goods. The traps that sink students. Here's where students consistently lose points, so pay close attention. The most common MCQ trap with income elasticity is confusing the direction of income change with the type of good. Always identify the goods classification first, then determine which direction demand shifts. Don't let the question flip your thinking. A second major trap involves cross-price elasticity sign interpretation. Students sometimes confuse which goods quantity and which goods price they're computing. The formula is percent change in quantity of A over percent change in price of B, not the other way around. If the question gives you numbers, plug carefully. Also remember, it's possible for XED to be asymmetric in context. The relationship between goods matters, not just the raw number. Third trap. Students sometimes think a negative income elasticity means the demand curve slopes upward. It doesn't. The demand curve for inferior goods still slopes downward in the normal way. The inferiority shows up in the shift, not the slope. Connections across the course. These elasticities connect beautifully to other AP micro topics you'll encounter. In Unit 3, when you study production and cost, understanding that a good is a luxury versus necessity helps you think about revenue volatility for firms. In Unit 4, market structures, particularly monopolistic competition, involve firms competing for customers who treat goods as substitutes, making cross-price elasticity directly relevant to pricing strategy. And throughout Unit 2, every time you encounter a demand shifter like income increased or the price of a related good changed, you're implicitly using income or cross-price elasticity reasoning to determine the direction and size of the demand shift. With income and cross-price elasticity now in your toolkit, you've got a complete picture of how sensitive demand is to all the forces that shape it, which sets you up perfectly to explore how firms actually use this information when they make pricing decisions. 2.9 Elasticity and Tax Incidence, relating elasticity to burden distribution. The central question, who actually pays the tax? Here's a thought experiment that trips up students every single year. A government imposes a 2 per pack tax on cigarettes, and by law, the tax is collected directly from tobacco companies. So the companies pay the tax, right? Well, not exactly. Whether a tax is legally collected from the seller or the buyer is almost completely irrelevant to who actually bears the economic burden of that tax. That's the core insight of tax incidence, and once it clicks, you'll never look at a tax policy debate the same way. Tax incidence is the study of how the burden of a tax is distributed between buyers and sellers, and the single most powerful determinant of that distribution? Elasticity. The more inelastic your side of the market, the more of the tax burden you end up carrying. Think of it like this. Whoever needs this transaction more will end up absorbing more of the cost. The party with fewer alternatives gets stuck with the bill. Drawing and reading the tax incidence graph. You absolutely need to be able to draw this graph and label it precisely. Start with your standard supply and demand diagram. The equilibrium before the tax is at price P1 and quantity Q1. Now, a per unit tax is imposed. If the tax is legally placed on sellers, the supply curve shifts leftward, by exactly the amount of the tax. Let's call it the tax wedge, represented by the letter T. The new supply curve is S2. The new equilibrium quantity falls to Q2, and buyers now pay a higher price, P buyers. Sellers, however, don't keep that full price. They hand over the tax and are left with P sellers, which is lower than P1. The vertical distance between P buyers and P sellers is exactly T, the size of the tax. That gap is your tax wedge, and it visually represents the entire burden being split between buyers and sellers. The buyer's share of the burden is P buyers minus P1, how much the price rose for consumers. The seller's share is P1 minus P sellers, how much the net price fell for producers. Label all 5 of these: P buyers, P sellers, Q1, Q2, the tax wedge, and the deadweight loss triangle. That deadweight loss, the triangle between Q2, Q1, and the wedge, represents the transactions that no longer happen because the tax drove buyers and sellers apart. College Board loves to ask about this area. The elasticity rule. Who carries the burden? Here's the rule you need to memorize in both directions. When demand is more inelastic relative to supply, buyers bear more of the tax burden. When supply is more inelastic relative to demand, sellers bear more of the burden. The intuition is beautiful. Inelastic means I don't have good alternatives. I'm going to keep participating in this market no matter what. So if buyers are addicted to cigarettes' highly inelastic demand, sellers can pass most of the tax on to them through higher prices, because buyers will keep buying. If sellers are locked into a specialized industry with no alternative uses for their resources, highly inelastic supply, buyers can essentially say, lower your price or I'm walking, and sellers absorb more of the tax. Let's anchor this with a calculation example. Say before the tax, the price is $5. After a $2 tax, buyers pay $6 and sellers net $4. Buyers absorbed $1 of the $2 tax, that's 50%. Sellers absorbed $1, also 50%. In this case, the elasticities happen to be roughly equal. Now imagine buyers pay $6.50 and sellers net $4.50. Buyers absorbed $1.50 out of $2, which is 75% of the burden. Sellers absorbed varn on $5, just 25%. This tells you demand is more inelastic than supply in this scenario. The extreme cases, these are MCQ favorites. The edge cases are where exam traps live, so pay close attention. When demand is perfectly inelastic, a vertical demand curve, buyers bear 100% of the tax. The price simply rises by the full amount of the tax. Quantity doesn't change at all, and there's zero deadweight loss. A medical insulin example fits here beautifully. If you need insulin to survive, you'll pay whatever the price becomes. When demand is perfectly elastic, a horizontal demand curve, sellers bear 100% of the tax. The price buyers pay can't rise at all because they'd immediately substitute away, so sellers absorb the entire tax, and the quantity drop is substantial. The deadweight loss is large. Flip those for supply. Perfectly inelastic supply means sellers bear 100%, with no deadweight loss and no quantity change. Perfectly elastic supply means buyers bear 100%. Memorize those four corner cases. They appear constantly on multiple choice. Common traps and misconceptions. The most dangerous trap is confusing legal incidents with economic incidents. The AP exam may describe a tax collected from businesses and ask, who bears the burden? The answer depends entirely on relative elasticities, not on who writes the check to the government. A seller collecting a tax and a buyer paying a tax at the register. If the elasticities are the same, the economic outcome is identical. This is called the equivalence of tax placement, and it's a concept College Board specifically tests. A second trap involves the direction of the supply shift. A per-unit tax on sellers shifts the supply curve up by the tax amount, not the demand curve. Students sometimes draw it the wrong way. If the tax is on buyers, the demand curve shifts down by the tax amount. And here's the beautiful thing. The final outcome in terms of P buyers, P sellers, Q2, and burden distribution is exactly the same either way. The wedge is the wedge, regardless of which curve you shift. Connecting to other units. This topic weaves through the entire course. In Unit 1, you learned about price elasticity of demand and supply. Those formulas PED equals % delta QD divided by % delta P and PES equals % delta Qs divided by delta P delta P. In Unit 4 and beyond, when you study factor markets, incidence analysis applies to payroll taxes. Economists broadly agree that even employer-side payroll taxes are partly borne by workers through lower wages, because labor supply is relatively inelastic compared to labor demand in many contexts. In Unit 2's broader discussion of market efficiency, the deadweight loss created by taxes connects directly to consumer and producer surplus. The tax wedge destroys some of both, and that destroyed surplus doesn't go to the government either. It's just gone. The government does collect revenue, though, and its size is the tax per unit times Q2, a rectangle sitting inside that wedge. That tax revenue plus the consumer surplus loss plus producer surplus loss equals the total welfare change. Understanding what's a transfer to government versus what's true deadweight loss is a frequent FRQ scoring point. With tax incidence mastered, you've now connected elasticity to real-world policy outcomes in a powerful way, and that analytical framework will serve you perfectly as we turn to examining how market structures shape price and output decisions in the units ahead. 2.10 Consumer and Producer Surplus. What are we really measuring here? Let's talk about something that sounds abstract but is actually all around you every single day. Imagine you're at a coffee shop, fitting, right? And you'd be willing to pay up to $6 for your latte. The barista rings you up and it's only $4. That $2 difference, that's yours to keep in a sense. That's the feeling of getting a deal, and economists have a precise name for it: consumer surplus. Now, flip the perspective. The coffee shop was willing to sell that latte for as little as $2 and still make it worth their while. They sold it for $4. That extra $2 above their minimum, that's producer surplus. Together, consumer and producer surplus make up what we call total surplus, and this concept is the backbone of how economists measure the well-being a market creates. defining the terms precisely. The College Board wants you to use exact language, so let's nail it down. Consumer surplus is the difference between the maximum price a consumer is willing and able to pay for a good and the actual price they pay. It represents the net benefit consumers receive from participating in a market. Producer surplus is the difference between the minimum price a seller is willing and able to accept and the price they actually receive. It represents the net benefit producers receive. Total surplus, sometimes called social surplus or allocative efficiency surplus, is simply consumer surplus plus producer surplus. It measures the total net benefit to society from market activity. Here's a crucial phrase the AP exam loves. Total surplus is maximized at the competitive equilibrium. That's the whole ballgame for understanding why free markets are so efficient. And we'll come back to that when you study market failures and government interventions later in the course. Drawing the graph. This is non-negotiable. You absolutely must be able to draw and interpret this graph. Start with your standard supply and demand diagram. Draw a downward sloping demand curve and an upward sloping supply curve. Mark the equilibrium price, P, and equilibrium quantity, Q, where they intersect. Now here's where it gets visual. Consumer surplus is the triangle above the equilibrium price and below the demand curve, bounded on the left by the price axis. Think of it this way. The demand curve represents each consumer's willingness to pay. Every consumer whose willingness to pay exceeds P gets a surplus equal to that difference. The highest point of this triangle sits at the demand curve's intercept with the price axis, the maximum any consumer would pay. The base of the triangle runs along P star from the y-axis to Q. Producer surplus is the triangle below the equilibrium price and above the supply curve, bounded on the left by the price axis. The supply curve represents sellers' minimum acceptable prices, their marginal costs, essentially. Every seller whose minimum price is below P earns a surplus. The lowest point of this triangle is where the supply curve hits the price axis. For the formula, the area of a triangle is 1/2 times base times height. So if you're given numbers, say the equilibrium price is $4, the demand intercept is $8, and the equilibrium quantity is 100, consumer surplus is 1/2 times $100 times 8 minus 4 equals Ijterat's 2020 R8s. You need to be comfortable doing this calculation quickly on the FRQ. Market efficiency and why equilibrium maximizes surplus. At the competitive equilibrium, total surplus is at its why? Yeah. This connects directly to Unit 2's bigger theme. The price mechanism does extraordinary work. It coordinates millions of decisions without anyone directing traffic, and in doing so, it maximizes social welfare. When you get to Unit 4 on imperfect competition, you'll see how monopolies destroy surplus. This is why. Common MCQ traps and how to dodge them. The AP exam is very good at tripping students up on this topic, so pay attention. The first trap is confusing surplus with profit or utility. Producer surplus is not the same as profit. It's revenue above the minimum willingness to accept. It doesn't account for fixed costs. Profit is revenue minus all costs. They're related but not identical. The second trap involves price changes and redistribution. If the price rises above equilibrium, say due to a price floor, consumer surplus shrinks. Producer surplus may rise, but not by as much as consumers lose, and a deadweight loss triangle appears. The lost surplus is gone. It doesn't go to anyone. Students often mistakenly calculate the redistributed surplus as total surplus. It isn't. Deadweight loss represents permanently destroyed value. The third trap is the parallel shift question. If demand increases, where does the new consumer surplus come from? The triangle gets bigger, but students sometimes misread the new triangles. Remember that both consumer and producer surplus increase when demand increases at equilibrium. The supply curve being upward sloping means producers also benefit from higher prices. Don't assume only one group gains. Edge cases worth memorizing. When supply is perfectly inelastic, A vertical supply curve. Producer surplus is a rectangle, not a triangle. It's equal to P stars minus 0 times Q, since suppliers would supply the same quantity at any price down to 0. When supply is perfectly elastic, a horizontal supply curve, producer surplus is 0, producers are paid exactly their minimum acceptable price for every unit. Mirror image logic applies to demand. On MCQs, these extreme elasticity cases frequently appear with surplus questions, so sketch them quickly and use the appropriate area formula. Connections to the rest of the course. Consumer and producer surplus don't live in isolation. They're woven through almost every unit that follows. In Unit 2, you'll immediately apply these concepts when studying price controls, ceilings and floors, and taxes, where you calculate deadweight loss as the surplus that is destroyed. In Unit 3, when you explore externalities, you'll see that positive externalities mean the social surplus is larger than what the private market captures. In Unit 4 and 5, monopolies and oligopolies charge above marginal cost, which transfers surplus from consumers to producers and creates deadweight loss. You'll draw those welfare triangles constantly. Understanding surplus is essentially understanding economic efficiency, which is the lens economists use to evaluate virtually every policy question. Wrapping up, the beautiful thing about consumer and producer surplus is that they give you a way to measure something as fuzzy as how good is this market for people with crisp geometry and arithmetic. Master the triangles, know your formulas, and always ask yourself whether a change in market conditions is creating, destroying, or redistributing surplus, and you'll be well ahead of the curve. Speaking of things that destroy surplus, let's turn now to one of the most exam-heavy applications of these concepts. What happens when governments step in and set prices? Your guide to price controls. 2.11 Allocative efficiency and total surplus. The big question: are we getting the most out of our markets? Imagine you're at a farmer's market on a Saturday morning. There's a vendor selling fresh strawberries, and you absolutely love strawberries. You'd happily pay $5 for a pint, but the price on the sign says $3. You buy them, hand over $3, and walk away feeling pretty good about that deal. That warm, fuzzy feeling you just experienced? That's not just happiness, that's consumer surplus. And it's one of the most important concepts you'll need to master for the AP exam. Let's build this out carefully, because everything in section 2.11 connects together like pieces of a puzzle. And once you see how they fit, the logic becomes almost automatic. Consumer surplus, producer surplus, and the welfare triangle. Consumer surplus is defined as the difference between the maximum price a consumer is willing and able to pay for a good, their willingness to pay, and the actual market price they do pay. In our strawberry example, your willingness to pay was $5. The price was $3, and so your consumer surplus was $2. On a supply and demand graph, consumer surplus appears as the triangular area above the equilibrium price line and below the demand curve. Picture your standard graph: price on the vertical axis, quantity on the horizontal axis, a downward sloping demand curve, and an upward sloping supply curve intersecting at equilibrium. That triangle sitting above the price and below the demand curve, that's consumer surplus. And you need to be able to identify, shade, and calculate it. Producer surplus mirrors this concept from the seller's side. It's the difference between the price a producer actually receives and the minimum price they would have accepted, their willingness to accept, or in other words, their marginal cost. If it costs a strawberry farmer $2 to bring a pint to market and they sell it for $3, that's $1 of producer surplus per unit. On the graph, producer surplus is the triangle below the equilibrium price and above the supply curve. Together, consumer surplus and producer surplus form total surplus, also called total welfare or social surplus. Total surplus is simply consumer surplus plus producer surplus, and it represents the total benefit to society from all the transactions that take place in a market. Calculating these areas is a tested skill on the AP exam. Since both regions are triangles, you'll use the formula 1/2 times base times height. For consumer surplus, the height of the triangle runs from the equilibrium price up to the price axis intercept of the demand curve, the point where the demand curve hits the vertical axis, and the base is the equilibrium quantity. For producer surplus, the height runs from the supply curve's price axis intercept up to the equilibrium price, and the base is again the equilibrium quantity. When the AP exam gives you specific numbers for a linear supply and demand setup, expect to calculate these values precisely. Practice this until it's second nature. Allocative efficiency, the sweet spot. Here's where the concept gets philosophically powerful. A market achieves allocative efficiency when the quantity produced and consumed is exactly right, meaning society is producing the goods that consumers value most at a level where the last unit produced is worth exactly what it cost to make. The technical condition for allocative efficiency is that price equals marginal cost, or equivalently, that marginal benefit equals marginal cost at the quantity being produced. Why does the competitive equilibrium naturally land on this point? Think about it this way. Every unit traded in a market where price equals marginal cost generates positive net value for society. But if a unit is produced where marginal cost exceeds marginal benefit, if it costs more to make that extra pint of strawberries than anyone values it, then producing it actually destroys value. The market, when functioning competitively, automatically finds the quantity where total surplus is maximized, and that is allocative efficiency. The equilibrium point on your supply and demand graph is precisely where this condition holds, which is why we say competitive markets are allocatively efficient. Deadweight loss, the cost of getting it wrong. Now, here's where things get really important for the exam and for real-world policy. Whenever the quantity traded in a market is anything other than the equilibrium quantity, total surplus falls below its maximum. That lost surplus has a name: deadweight loss. It's the reduction in total surplus that results from market inefficiency. On your graph, deadweight loss appears as a triangle between the demand and supply curves, to the right or left of the equilibrium quantity, depending on whether the market is producing too little or too much. If a price floor, price ceiling, tax, subsidy, or monopoly pushes quantity away from the efficient equilibrium level, a deadweight loss triangle appears, and the AP exam will absolutely ask you to identify, shade, and sometimes calculate it. The formula is again 1/2 times base times height, where the base is the difference between the efficient quantity and the actual quantity, and the height is the gap between the demand curve and supply curve at that quantity. A critical conceptual point: deadweight loss doesn't belong to anyone. It's not transferred from consumers to producers or vice versa. It simply vanishes. This distinguishes it from a transfer of surplus, which is when one group gains at the expense of another, as happens with a tax where government collects revenue that was formerly consumer or producer surplus. Common MCQ traps and FRQ scoring points. The trap students fall into most often is confusing a transfer of surplus with deadweight loss. If a price ceiling lowers consumer prices, consumers gain surplus that used to belong to producers. That's a transfer, not deadweight loss. The deadweight loss is the additional triangle that neither party captures. Always shade them separately on your FRQ graphs. Another common mistake is assuming that any government intervention destroys total surplus. A corrective tax on a negative externality can actually reduce deadweight loss rather than create it, a concept you'll explore deeper in Unit 4 when market failures and externalities come into focus. The allocative efficiency framework here in Unit 2 is the foundation for all of that later analysis. Also, watch out for questions that ask what happens to total surplus when a market moves to equilibrium from a non-equilibrium position. The answer is always that total surplus increases. Moving toward equilibrium always increases total welfare. Connections across the course. Everything you've learned in this section echoes throughout the entire AP Microeconomics course. In Unit 3, when you analyze perfectly competitive firms, you'll see that P equals MC at the profit-maximizing output, which is also the allocatively efficient output, and that's not a coincidence. In Unit 4, externalities and public goods are framed entirely as failures of allocative efficiency. In Unit 5, when you study factor markets, the concept of surplus reappears as economic rent. And in Unit 3, when examining monopolies, you'll measure monopolies' harm to society precisely by calculating the deadweight loss triangle it creates. With total surplus firmly in your toolkit, you're ready to take on one of the most consequential concepts in all of microeconomics. What happens when markets fail to reach that efficient equilibrium on their own? 2.12 Deadweight loss. The cost of inefficiency. Imagine your favorite pizza place is offering a large pizza for $12. You'd gladly pay $15, your roommate would pay $13, and your study partner would pay $11. The shop is willing to make each pizza for $10. In a perfectly competitive, efficient market, you and your roommate both buy pizzas, you each pay $12, both feel like you got a deal, and the pizza shop happily covers its costs. Your study partner, who only valued the pizza at $11, doesn't buy one, and that's fine. It would have cost more to make it than it was worth to them. Everyone who should trade does. Everyone who shouldn't doesn't. Economists call this outcome allocatively efficient, and it's the gold standard we're always chasing. But what happens when something distorts that perfect outcome? What happens when a price floor, a price ceiling, a tax, or a subsidy pushes the market away from that beautiful equilibrium? Some trades that should happen, trades where the buyer's willingness to pay exceeds the seller's cost, simply don't. Other trades that shouldn't happen do. Either way, value that could have existed in the world just evaporates. That evaporated value has a name, deadweight loss, sometimes called DWL. College Board defines it as the loss of economic efficiency that occurs when the equilibrium outcome is not achieved, the total surplus that is forfeited when mutually beneficial transactions don't take place. Visualizing deadweight loss on a graph. Here's where you absolutely must be able to draw and label a graph from scratch, because the AP exam will ask you to do exactly that. Start with your standard supply and demand diagram. The downward sloping demand curve represents buyers' marginal benefit, how much each successive unit is worth to consumers. The upward sloping supply curve represents sellers' marginal cost, how much each successive unit costs producers to make. Where they intersect is the competitive equilibrium, price P and quantity Q. Now imagine a tax is imposed on this market. Buyers pay a higher price, sellers receive a lower price, and the quantity traded falls from Q tops to a new smaller quantity, call it QT. Here's the critical visual. The deadweight loss is the triangle formed between the supply curve, the demand curve, and the vertical line at QT. That triangle points toward Q, the old equilibrium. Its three corners are the price buyers pay, the price sellers receive, and the old equilibrium quantity. The area of this triangle represents all the gains from trade that were destroyed, transactions where a willing buyer and a willing seller could have made each other better off, but didn't because the tax wedge got in the way. To calculate that area, you use the triangle area formula. DWL equals half times base times height. The base is the change in quantity, Q times minus QT. The height is the tax wedge, the gap between what buyers pay and what sellers receive. Suppose a tax causes quantity to fall from 100 units to 80 units, and the tax per unit is $4. Then DWL equals a half times 20 times $4 equals 40. That $40 is not collected by the government, not kept by consumers, not pocketed by producers. It simply ceases to exist as economic value. This is the formula you need to memorize cold for FRQ scoring. What causes deadweight loss and what doesn't? Every source of deadweight loss on the AP exam works through the same mechanism. It prevents the market from reaching Q price. Floors set above equilibrium cause quantity traded to fall below Q, generating DWL on the supply side of the triangle. Price ceilings set below equilibrium cause quantity traded to fall below Q, generating DWL on the demand side. Taxes always reduce quantity and create a triangle of DWL. This connects directly to Unit 2's coverage of tax incidence. Subsidies actually push quantity above Q, and this is a trap students frequently miss. Overproduction also destroys surplus. When society produces more of a good than people value at cost, resources are wasted, and DWL appears on the other side of the equilibrium point. The triangle still forms, it just opens toward the right instead of the left. One edge case you must know: if a price floor or ceiling is set at or beyond the equilibrium price, say a price floor below the current market price, it is non-binding and has no effect on quantity traded, which means there is no deadweight loss. This is a classic MCQ trap. If someone tells you a price floor is set at $5 and the equilibrium price is $8, that floor is irrelevant. Circle no deadweight loss with confidence. Connecting DWL to elasticity and other units. Here's a concept that ties this topic to Unit 2's elasticity material in a way that AP exam writers love to test. The more elastic supply and demand are, the larger the deadweight loss from a given tax or price control. Think about it intuitively. If buyers and sellers are highly responsive to price changes, a tax causes a big drop in quantity. A wide base on your triangle, meaning more mutually beneficial trades are destroyed. Inelastic markets see smaller quantity reductions and therefore smaller DWL. This is why governments often prefer to tax goods with inelastic demand, like gasoline or cigarettes. Not just because it raises more revenue, but because it causes less allocative inefficiency. This topic also connects forward to Unit 4, imperfect competition, in a major way. When you study monopoly, you'll see that a monopolist restricts output below Q2 to raise price above marginal cost. That restriction creates deadweight loss, the same triangle, the same logic. The monopoly DWL triangle sits between the monopolist's quantity and the competitive equilibrium quantity. College Board FRQs frequently ask you to shade and label this region on a monopoly graph, so the foundations you're building here will pay off enormously later. The common misconceptions and FRQ traps. Two traps appear on the AP exam with remarkable frequency. First, students often confuse tax revenue with total surplus. Tax revenue is a transfer. It moves from consumers and producers to the government, but it doesn't vanish. DWL is what's left over after you subtract consumer surplus lost, producer surplus lost, and tax revenue collected. The DWL is the portion of lost surplus that nobody gets. Second, students draw the DWL triangle pointing the wrong direction. Remember, the triangle always opens toward Q ends, the old equilibrium. If you're drawing a tax, the triangle points right. If you're drawing a subsidy-induced overproduction, it points left. Getting the orientation wrong on an FRQ graph will cost you points even if your logic is perfect. For FRQ scoring, College Board typically awards points for correctly labeling the DWL region on a graph, correctly identifying the triangle's 3 vertices, and correctly computing the area using the half times base times height formula. Partial credit is available, so even if you can't compute the number, shading the correct region earns you something. With deadweight loss firmly in your toolkit, you're ready to step into one of the most powerful applications of surplus analysis, understanding how taxes and subsidies affect market outcomes and who ultimately bears the burden, which brings us right to the topic of tax incidence. 2.13. The effects of government intervention in markets. Let's talk about what happens when the government decides it knows better than the market. Sometimes it does. Sometimes it creates a beautiful mess. Either way, this topic is absolutely loaded with AP exam points, and if you understand the logic deeply, you'll be able to handle almost any question they throw at you. Price ceilings. When government puts a cap on prices. Imagine your city decides that rent is getting out of hand, and honestly, maybe it is, so the government steps in and says, landlords, you cannot charge more than $800 a month. That's a price ceiling, a legally imposed maximum price. The critical rule to memorize is this: a price ceiling only creates a problem when it's set below the equilibrium price. We call that a binding price ceiling. If the government set the rent ceiling at $2,000 and equilibrium is already $800, it's non-binding. The market ignores it and nothing changes. On the AP exam, they will absolutely try to trick you with a non-binding ceiling, so always check whether the ceiling is above or below equilibrium before you do anything else. Now, when a price ceiling is binding, set below equilibrium, draw this graph carefully. Start with your standard supply and demand curves crossing at equilibrium price, P, and quantity Q. Draw a horizontal dashed line below P and label it P ceiling. At that lower price, the quantity demanded is higher than at equilibrium. Read off the demand curve, and the quantity supplied is lower. Read off the supply curve. The gap between Q supplied and Q demanded is your shortage, also called excess demand. Label this clearly on your graph. The AP exam asks you to identify it constantly. Here's the intuition. You've made the good artificially cheap, so consumers want more of it, but producers have less incentive to supply it. The result is a shortage, like the empty store shelves for rent-controlled apartments where the waiting lists stretch for years. Deadweight loss also appears here. The transactions that would have happened between Q supplied and Q don't happen. Draw that triangle between the supply and demand curves from Q supplied to Q stop and shade it. That's your deadweight loss, a loss of total surplus that benefits no one. Price floors, when government puts a floor under prices. Now flip the picture. A price floor is a legally imposed minimum price. The classic example is the minimum wage. The government says workers must be paid at least $15 per hour. A binding price floor is set above equilibrium price. That's the only time it matters. Below equilibrium, it's non-binding and irrelevant. On your graph, draw the horizontal dashed line above P. At the higher price, quantity supplied exceeds quantity demanded. That gap is a surplus, also called excess supply. In the labor market, a surplus of labor is unemployment. In an agricultural market with a price floor on wheat, it's an unsold stockpile. The same deadweight loss triangle appears. Shade the area between Q demanded and QS bounded by supply and demand. These are trades that could have made both parties better off, but now don't happen because the price is too high. A critical distinction to keep crisp for the exam. Ceilings cause shortages, floors cause surpluses. Students mix these up constantly. Here's my trick. Think of it physically. A ceiling is above you, meaning you can't go above it. But the ceiling for prices is set below the market. That's the paradox that trips students up. Just anchor this. Ceiling below equals shortage. Floor above equals surplus. Taxes, the government takes a cut. Taxes are where things get beautifully mathematical. When the government imposes a per-unit excise tax, it drives a wedge between what consumers pay and what producers receive. Suppose a $2 tax is placed on each gallon of gasoline. You need to know two things: who bears the burden and what happens to quantity and surplus. On your graph, start with equilibrium. A tax on producers shifts the supply curve upward by the exact amount of the tax. The new supply curve is parallel to the old one, shifted up by $2. Find the new equilibrium where this new supply curve crosses demand. Consumers now pay a higher price, call it P consumer. Producers receive a lower price after handing over the tax, call it P producer. The vertical distance between P consumer and P producer equals the tax amount. Always check this. P consumer minus P producer equals the per unit tax. If the numbers don't work out to the tax size, you've made an error. Tax incidence, who actually pays the tax, depends on the relative elasticities of supply and demand. Here's the rule you need tattooed in your memory. The more inelastic side of the market bears more of the tax burden. If demand is perfectly inelastic, a vertical demand curve, consumers pay the entire tax. If supply is perfectly inelastic, producers pay the entire tax. In most real cases, it's shared, with the less elastic side bearing more. This is one of the most common FRQ topics, and the scoring rubric almost always asks you to justify the tax burden by referencing elasticity explicitly. Deadweight loss from a tax is that familiar triangle: the quantity traded falls from Q to Q tax, and the lost surplus from those foregone transactions is your deadweight loss. Government tax revenue is a rectangle, the tax per unit multiplied by Q tax. Visually, it sits between P consumer and P producer, spanning from 0 to Q tax. Subsidies, the reverse tax. A subsidy is essentially a negative tax. The government pays producers to supply more. The supply curve shifts down by the subsidy amount. Quantity increases beyond equilibrium, and both consumers and producers benefit, but the government pays. Here again, incidence depends on elasticity. The more inelastic side captures more of the benefit. Subsidies reduced Connecting to the bigger picture. These concepts weave through nearly every other unit. In Unit 3, when you study factor markets, minimum wage is a price floor in the labor market, the same graph, just with wages on the vertical axis. In Unit 4's imperfect competition, you'll see how monopoly pricing creates its own deadweight loss without any government intervention at all, which makes for powerful comparison questions. And in Unit 5, you'll see how externalities actually justify some government intervention. A corrective tax can reduce deadweight loss rather than create it. The edge case that catches students most often: when supply or demand is perfectly elastic or inelastic, the deadweight loss triangle changes shape dramatically. It can even disappear entirely. If demand is perfectly inelastic, the tax creates no deadweight loss because quantity doesn't change. Practice drawing these extreme cases. Next up, we're going to take everything we've learned about supply, demand, and surplus and use it to understand international trade, because once you put two countries together, the whole market opens up in a fascinating new way. 2.4 Price ceilings and price floors. What the government does when it doesn't like the market's answer. Imagine you're renting an apartment in a big city and the landlord wants to charge you $3,000 a month. The government looks at that and says, too high, we're going to cap rents. Or picture a farmer who can only sell corn for 50 cents a bushel, barely covering costs. The government steps in and says, too low, we'll guarantee a minimum price. Those two interventions have names: a price ceiling and a price floor, respectively, and they are absolutely guaranteed to appear on your AP Microeconomics exam. Let's make sure you understand them so thoroughly that when you see them, you almost smile. The core logic. When does government intervene? The free market produces an equilibrium price. the point where quantity supplied equals quantity demanded. But sometimes society decides that equilibrium is either too high, housing is unaffordable, medicine is out of reach, or too low. Farmers can't survive, workers can't pay rent. Price controls are the government's way of overriding the market. Here's the key insight you need to brand into your memory. A price control only matters if it's set on the other side of equilibrium. This single rule explains everything that follows. Price ceilings, drawing the graph and reading the story. A price ceiling is a legally imposed maximum price. Sellers cannot legally charge above this level. Think of it as a ceiling. You can't go above it. The classic real-world example is rent control, but the AP exam also loves to use gasoline price controls from the 1970s, prescription drug pricing, and ticket scalping laws. Now let's build the graph. Start with your standard supply and demand diagram. Draw a downward-sloping demand curve and an upward-sloping supply curve intersecting at equilibrium price P and equilibrium quantity Q to draw a binding price ceiling. You draw a horizontal dashed line below P, call it PC. That's the key. A price ceiling is only binding, meaning it actually changes market outcomes when it is set below equilibrium. If a government sets a price ceiling above equilibrium, nobody cares. The market was already trading below that cap, so it has no effect. This is a non-binding or ineffective ceiling, and the AP exam will absolutely try to trick you with one. When the ceiling is binding, read the graph carefully. At price PC, trace over to the supply curve that gives you Q's, the quantity supplied. Suppliers are only willing to produce a relatively small amount at that artificially low price. Then trace over to the demand curve that gives you QD, the quantity demanded. Consumers want a lot more of this good at the low price. The gap between Q's and QD is the shortage, also called excess demand. Label it clearly. Shortage equals QD minus QS. On your graph, the actual quantity traded in the market is the smaller of the two Q's because you can't force sellers to produce what they won't make. The consequences of a binding price ceiling ripple outward because the price mechanism can't do its rationing job. Shortages develop and non-price rationing takes over. Things like waiting in line, favoritism, or black markets where goods sell illegally above the ceiling. Consumer surplus and producer surplus shift in ways that create deadweight loss, a triangle of lost value to society sitting between QS and Q. You should be able to identify and shade that deadweight loss triangle on your graph. It's bounded by the demand curve above, the supply curve below, and the vertical line at Q is on the left side. Price floors, the mirror image. A price floor is a legally imposed minimum price. No one can legally sell below it. Think of a floor you can't go beneath. The two examples the AP exam returns to over and over are the federal minimum wage, a floor in the labor market. And yes, the labor market is just supply and demand with workers and firms and agricultural price supports, where the government guarantees farmers a minimum price per bushel. Draw the same supply and demand graph. Now draw your horizontal dashed line above P. Call it PF. A binding price floor must be set above equilibrium. At price, PF, trace to the demand curve for QD. Buyers want relatively little at this high price. Trace to the supply curve for Q's. Sellers want to produce a lot at this attractive price. Now the gap runs the other way. QS exceeds QD, creating a surplus or excess supply. Label it. Surplus equals QS minus QD. The quantity actually traded is again the smaller number QD because you can't force buyers to purchase what they don't want. With a price floor, the deadweight loss triangle sits between QD and Q, bounded by the demand curve on top and the supply curve below. Unsold goods pile up. The government sometimes buys the surplus itself, as it did for decades with agricultural products, which is a budget cost that connects this topic to government spending discussions in broader economics. The MCQ traps you must avoid. The most common trap on multiple choice is confusing which side of equilibrium a control must sit on to be binding. Burn this in: ceiling below, floor above. A ceiling set above equilibrium does nothing. A floor set below equilibrium does nothing. If you see a question describing a price ceiling set above equilibrium, the answer is almost always no effect on price or quantity. The second big trap is assuming that the intended beneficiary of a price control actually benefits. Rent control is meant to help tenants, but reduced housing supply and long waiting lists can leave many people worse off. Minimum wage is meant to help workers, but reduced quantity of labor demanded means some workers lose their jobs. The AP exam loves asking about unintended consequences. Third, don't confuse who benefits from each control in the short run. With a price ceiling, consumers who do get the good pay less and gain surplus, but only those lucky enough to secure the limited supply. With a price floor, producers who do sell receive more and gain surplus, but only those lucky enough to find buyers. Connecting to other units. Price controls connect directly to Unit 2's broader theme of market efficiency and the role of prices as signals. They also tie into Unit 5, where market failure and government intervention are discussed in the context of externalities and public goods, both situations where price controls sometimes appear as policy responses. In the labor market section you'll encounter later in the course, the minimum wage is essentially a price floor applied to wages, and all the same logic applies perfectly. Wrapping up, price ceilings and price floors are two sides of the same coin. Both interrupt the market's self-correcting mechanism, both create either shortages or surpluses, and both generate deadweight loss. Master the graph, remember which direction each control must be set to bite, and always ask yourself, what happens to quantity traded? Who gains, who loses, and where does deadweight loss show up? With those questions answered, you'll own this topic on exam day. Next up, we're going to take everything you've learned about supply, demand, and market outcomes and explore how markets for different goods are connected through the concept of elasticity in greater depth, which turns out to be the key to predicting just how large those shortages and surpluses really are. 2.15 Taxes, subsidies, and their incidence. The big picture, government thumbs on the scale. Imagine you're at a farmer's market and the government decides to place a 10-cent tax on every cup of lemonade sold. The seller might groan and immediately tack that dime onto the price. But here's the thing. Just because the seller collects the tax doesn't mean the seller pays the tax. That's the essential insight of tax incidence, and it's one of the most testable ideas in all of AP Microeconomics. Tax and subsidy analysis is really just supply and demand in disguise, with a government policy layered on top. Once you see it that way, everything clicks. Taxes. What happens to supply and demand? When the government levies a per-unit tax, sometimes called an excise tax, on a good, it raises the cost of selling that good. Think of it as adding a toll booth between the producer and the consumer. Producers must now pay the government for every unit they sell, so their marginal cost rises by exactly the amount of the tax. This shifts the supply curve upward, or leftward, by the amount of the tax. The demand curve doesn't move because consumer preferences haven't changed. Here's how to draw this on the AP exam. Start with your standard supply and demand diagram. Label the original equilibrium price, P1, and quantity Q1. Now draw a new supply curve, S2, that sits exactly above S1 by the amount of the tax. Let's call the tax T. The vertical distance between S1 and S2 at any quantity equals T. The new equilibrium is where S2 intersects the original demand curve. Label this new price PC, the price consumers pay, and the new quantity Q2. The price producers actually receive after handing the tax to the government is PP, which equals PC minus T. You'll draw a horizontal line at PP as well. College Board expects you to clearly identify PC, PP, Q2, and the tax wedge between them. The tax wedge is the vertical distance between PC and PP, and it equals T, always. That's your anchor when reading these graphs. Tax incidence, who really pays. Here's where students most often lose points. The legal incidence, who writes the check to the government, is completely irrelevant to the economic incidence, who actually bears the burden. Whether the tax is placed on buyers or sellers, the economic outcome is identical. This is one of the most common MCQ traps. If a question says a tax is placed on sellers versus a tax is placed on buyers, your graph and your welfare analysis should yield the same result as long as the tax amount is the same. What actually determines who bears more of the burden? Elasticity. Whichever side of the market is less elastic, less responsive to price changes, bears a larger share of the tax burden. Think about it intuitively. If you're a buyer who absolutely must have insulin, you can't easily walk away when the price rises, so sellers can pass most of the tax on to you. If you're a seller with highly elastic supply, meaning you can easily redirect your product elsewhere, buyers bear more of the burden because sellers just move on. The formula is worth knowing. The consumer's burden equals PC minus P1, and the producer's burden equals P1 minus PP. They add up to T, the total tax per unit. Tax revenue collected by the government equals T multiplied by Q2. That's the tax wedge times the new equilibrium quantity, visible as a rectangle on your graph between PC and PP, spanning from 0 to Q2, Deadweight loss, the cost of intervention, because the tax raises the price consumers pay and lowers the price producers receive. The quantity traded falls from Q1 to Q2. Those transactions that would have been mutually beneficial, where a buyer's willingness to pay exceeded a seller's willingness to accept, no longer happen. This lost surplus is called deadweight loss, and it's the triangle on your graph bounded by the old supply curve, the old demand curve, and the vertical line at Q2. Be precise when you shade this. It sits to the right of Q2 and to the left of Q1 between the two original curves. The key formula for deadweight loss is 1/2 times the tax amount times the reduction in quantity, or DWL equals 1/2 times T times Q1 minus Q2. The more elastic both sides of the market are, the larger this triangle becomes because quantity falls more sharply. Perfectly inelastic demand or supply eliminates deadweight loss entirely. Quantity doesn't change, so no mutually beneficial trades are lost, though the burden all falls on the inelastic side. That's your edge case for MCQs. A perfectly inelastic demand curve means consumers bear 100% of the tax and there is zero deadweight loss. Subsidies, the mirror image. A subsidy works exactly like a tax in reverse, and that symmetry is your best friend on the AP exam. A per-unit subsidy lowers the cost of production, shifting the supply curve downward or rightward by the subsidy amount. Equilibrium quantity rises, the price consumers pay falls, and the price producers receive after the subsidy rises. There's a producer subsidy component and a consumer subsidy component, and together they equal the total subsidy per unit. Subsidies also create deadweight loss, which surprises many students because the subsidy encourages production beyond the socially optimal quantity Q1. Resources are devoted to trades where the cost of production exceeds buyers' willingness to pay. The deadweight loss triangle now sits to the right of Q1 between the extended supply and demand curves. The government expenditure on the subsidy equals the subsidy per unit multiplied by the new quantity, a rectangle you can identify on the graph. Connections and common traps. This topic threads through the entire course. In Unit 4, when you study market failures and externalities, taxes become Pigouvian tools. A corrective tax set equal to the marginal external cost actually eliminates deadweight loss rather than creating it. That's a crucial distinction. In Unit 3, when you analyze firms' decisions, per-unit taxes shift marginal cost curves and affect profit-maximizing output. When you get to factor markets in Unit 5, the same incidence logic applies to payroll taxes. Economists broadly agree. Workers bear most of the burden because labor supply tends to be less elastic than labor demand. The most common FRQ trap is forgetting to distinguish between PC and PP when labeling your graph. College Board Rubrics Award points specifically for correctly identifying both prices and placing the tax wedge between them. If you label only one price or mislabel which is which, you'll lose points even if your graph shape is right. Draw slowly, label everything, and always check that PC is above the original price, and PP is below it for a tax and the reverse for a subsidy. With your understanding of how government policies distort market outcomes and redistribute surplus, you're perfectly set up to explore the next dimension of market failure, externalities, where we'll see how taxes can sometimes be the cure rather than the disease. 2.16 Tariffs and Quotas. The big picture. Why governments interfere with free trade. Imagine you're running a small pizza shop, and suddenly a massive international chain moves in next door and sells slices for half your price. You'd want someone to do something, right? That's essentially what domestic industries feel when cheaper foreign goods flood their market. To respond, governments have two main tools at their disposal: tariffs and quotas. These are called trade barriers, and understanding them deeply, graphically, and numerically is exactly what the AP exam will test you on. Let's build this up carefully, because this topic rewards students who understand the underlying logic, not just the vocabulary. Setting the stage, the world price versus the domestic price. Before a tariff or quota exists, you need to understand the baseline. In a free trade environment, a country can import goods at the world price, which is typically lower than the domestic equilibrium price. Think of the world price as the going rate for a good on the global market, cheaper because foreign producers may have lower labor costs, better technology, or more efficient production. When a country opens to free trade at the world price, domestic quantity supplied falls. Domestic producers can't compete as effectively at the lower price. Domestic quantity demanded rises. Consumers love the lower price, and the gap between domestic supply and domestic demand is filled by imports. That gap, the horizontal distance between domestic quantity supplied and domestic quantity demanded at the world price, is your import quantity. Burn that into your memory. The tariff, a tax on imports. A tariff is simply a tax placed on imported goods. It raises the price foreign producers charge in the domestic market, which means the effective price in the country rises from the world price to what we call the tariff price, world price plus the tariff amount. Here's how you draw this on a supply and demand graph, and you absolutely must be able to draw this from scratch on an FRQ. Start with your standard domestic supply and demand curves, marking the world price as a horizontal line below the domestic equilibrium. At the world price, label the domestic quantity supplied QS and the domestic quantity demanded QD. The import gap is QD minus QS. Now raise the price by the tariff amount. Draw a new horizontal line at the tariff price. At this new higher price, domestic producers supply more. QS moves right to Qs, and consumers demand less. QD moves left to QD. The new import gap, QD minus Qs, is smaller than before. Fewer imports come in. Now label the areas inside this graph. The AP exam loves asking about them. The consumer surplus shrinks. Consumers pay more and buy less. The piece of lost consumer surplus is redistributed in three ways. First, some goes to domestic producers as producer surplus, since they now sell at a higher price. Second, some becomes government tariff revenue, the rectangle formed by the tariff amount, the vertical distance between world price and tariff price, multiplied by the new import quantity, QD prime minus QS. Third, and this is critical, two small triangles of value are simply destroyed. These are the deadweight loss of the tariff. One triangle sits above the domestic supply curve on the production side, representing the inefficiency of domestic producers making units they shouldn't have to. The other sits below the demand curve on the consumption side, representing goods consumers wanted but didn't buy because of the artificially high price. The quota, a limit on import quantity. A quota is a legal limit on how much of a good can be imported. Instead of raising the price directly, the government restricts the quantity, which, through the logic of supply and demand, ends up raising the price anyway. If you cap how many Japanese cars can enter the country, and American consumers still want lots of cars, prices rise until the market clears. The graph for a quota looks almost identical to a tariff graph. You find the world price, identify the free trade import gap, and then set the quota equal to some smaller import quantity. The market price rises to whatever level makes domestic quantity demanded minus domestic quantity supplied equal exactly the quota amount. That new price is called the quota price. Here's the key difference that the AP exam will test you on repeatedly. Under a tariff, the government collects revenue. Under a quota, that same rectangular area of value doesn't go to the government. It goes to whoever holds the import licenses, which are the rights to import that limited quantity. If foreign exporters hold those licenses, the revenue goes abroad. If domestic importers hold them, it stays home. Either way, that rectangle is called quota rents, not government revenue. The deadweight loss triangles are identical in shape and position to those in the tariff graph. The common exam traps. The most dangerous misconception on this topic is confusing tariffs and quotas as equivalent. They have the same shape of welfare effects, but critically different sources of the middle rectangle. A tariff creates government revenue, a quota creates quota rents. If an MCQ asks who benefits from a quota and the answer includes the government, that's wrong unless the government is specifically selling the import licenses. Another classic trap. Students forget that domestic producer surplus increases under both tariffs and quotas. Domestic producers are winners here. They face less competition and sell at higher prices. Meanwhile, consumers are always losers under trade barriers, which is why economists generally consider free trade to be welfare improving overall, even if politically unpopular. Watch out also for questions about small versus large countries. In the simplified AP model, you treat the domestic country as a price taker on the world market, meaning the world price is fixed regardless of what the domestic country does. This assumption keeps the graphs clean and is the standard AP framework. Connections to other topics. This topic weaves together almost everything from Unit 2. You're using consumer and producer surplus from Section 2.8, elasticity concepts to think about how sensitive buyers and sellers are to the price change, and the notion of market efficiency. When you get to Unit 4 and study factor markets, you'll revisit trade as it affects wages for domestic workers in import-competing industries. And in broader discussions of market failure, tariffs, and quotas represent a form of government intervention, one that creates deadweight loss, connecting to the efficiency debates throughout the course. Understanding that trade barriers always reduce total welfare in the domestic market. Consumer losses exceed the sum of producer gains and government revenue is a principle that can appear in FRQs asking you to evaluate policy. So make sure your graph work is clean, your area labels are precise, and you can articulate why the deadweight loss exists in plain language. Next up, we'll pull back and look at how all these market forces, prices, trade, intervention, come together when markets fail to allocate resources efficiently on their own, opening the door to externalities and public goods in Unit 3. 2.17 International Trade and Public Policy. Let's talk about one of the most policy-relevant topics on the entire AP Microeconomics exam, international trade. This is the section where economics stops being abstract and starts feeling like the evening news. Tariffs, trade deficits, buying American, these ideas are everywhere in public discourse, and the AP exam wants to make sure you understand exactly what's happening beneath the surface when a country opens or closes its borders to trade. The core setup, domestic versus world price. Everything in this topic begins with one critical comparison, the domestic price versus the world price. The domestic price is what the good would sell for if the country traded with nobody, your basic supply and demand equilibrium in isolation. The world price is the price available on the global market. Here's the key rule you need to tattoo on your brain. If the world price is below the domestic price, the country will import that good. If the world price is above the domestic price, the country will export it. Think of it this way. If the rest of the world can produce steel more cheaply than your domestic industry, rational consumers will buy from abroad and imports flood in. Conversely, if your farmers grow wheat more efficiently than anyone else, foreign buyers will come to you and exports flow out. Drawing the free trade graph, imports case. Let's walk through the most important graph in this entire section, because the AP exam loves to put variations of it on both the MCQ and FRQ sections. Draw your standard supply and demand diagram for a domestic market. Label your x-axis quantity and your y-axis price. Your domestic equilibrium sits where S and D cross. Call that P domestic. Now draw a horizontal line below the domestic equilibrium. That's your world price, P world. Because the world price is lower, domestic consumers are thrilled. They can buy more at a cheaper price. Domestic producers, however, are not thrilled at all. At this lower price, domestic producers are only willing to supply the quantity where P world intersects the supply curve. That's your domestic quantity supplied, QS, consumers meanwhile, demand. The much larger quantity, where P world hits the demand curve, that's your domestic quantity demanded, QD. The gap between Qs and QD is exactly the quantity imported. Mark that gap clearly on your graph. Now here's where the welfare analysis gets beautiful. Consumer surplus expands dramatically. It now covers the whole area under the demand curve and above P world. Producer surplus shrinks. It's the triangle above the supply curve and below P world up to Qs only. And because free trade creates no deadweight loss, total surplus in the economy is actually larger under free trade than under no trade domestic equilibrium. That's a key conceptual point. Free trade maximizes total surplus. Tariffs, the policy intervention you must master. Now, a government decides to protect its domestic producers by slapping a tariff on imports. A tariff is simply a tax on imported goods. Imagine the U.S. putting a $5 tariff per unit on imported solar panels. On your graph, the world price rises from P world to P world plus tariff, which we call P tariff. At this higher price, domestic producers are now willing to supply more. Let's call that the new Qs. Domestic consumers demand less. That's your new QD. The quantity imported shrinks to the gap between Qs and QD. Notice you now have 4 critical price quantity points on this graph, and you'll want to label all of them cleanly for FRQ credit. The welfare effects are where the exam really tests you. Consumer surplus shrinks. Consumers pay more and buy less. Producer surplus increases. Domestic producers get a higher price and sell more. The government collects tariff revenue, which equals the tariff amount multiplied by the quantity imported after the tariff. On the graph, that's a rectangle sitting right in the middle of what used to be consumer surplus. But here's the crucial part. Even after you account for the gains to producers and the government's revenue, There are two deadweight loss triangles, one on each side of the tariff revenue rectangle. These triangles represent the inefficiency created by the tariff. Total surplus falls. This is why most economists oppose tariffs as a policy tool. Quotas, the close cousin of the tariff. An import quota restricts the quantity of imports rather than taxing them. The visual effect on your supply and demand graph looks almost identical to a tariff. Price rises, quantity imported falls, consumer surplus shrinks, producer surplus grows, and deadweight loss triangles appear. The critical difference is who captures the middle rectangle. With a tariff, the government gets it as revenue. With a quota, that rectangle becomes quota rent. It goes to whoever holds the import licenses. On the exam, if a question asks what a tariff and quota have in common, the answer is that both reduce imports, raise domestic price, reduce consumer surplus, and create deadweight loss. The difference is the revenue versus quota rent distinction. Common MCQ traps to avoid. The exam loves to test a few subtle points here. First, students often confuse which direction surplus moves when an exporting country is analyzed instead of an importing one. In the export case, the world price is above the domestic equilibrium. Domestic producers gain enormous surplus. Domestic consumers lose surplus, and there are still two deadweight loss triangles if an export subsidy is introduced. So be ready for either scenario. Second, watch out for questions that ask whether a tariff benefits the economy as a whole. The answer is no, because the deadweight loss exceeds the gains, even though specific groups, producers, government benefit. Third, don't confuse the tariff revenue rectangle with a welfare gain. It's a transfer from consumers to the government, not a net creation of surplus. Connections to other units. This topic connects beautifully to Unit 3 when you study market structures, because firms in perfectly competitive markets are price takers, just like domestic markets are price takers relative to the world price. It also ties to Unit 1's production possibilities, Frontier, where comparative advantage explains why countries trade in the first place. And in Unit 5, when you study factor markets, you'll revisit how trade affects the wages of workers in import-competing industries, a key real-world implication of everything you've learned here. The big takeaway. International trade policy is really a story about distribution. Free trade maximizes the size of the pie, but changes who gets what slice. Tariffs and quotas shrink the pie while handing a bigger slice to domestic producers and, in the tariff case, to the government. The AP exam wants you to be fluent in drawing these graphs, calculating the welfare changes, and articulating why economists generally favor free trade, even when it creates political controversy. With international trade firmly under your belt, you're ready to step back and see the big picture of supply, demand, and policy together, setting you up perfectly as you move into the deeper market structure analysis waiting for you in Unit 3. 2.18 Graphs and Calculations. Interpreting shift, surplus areas, and equilibrium changes. Let's talk about the moment everything in supply and demand comes together, not just understanding why curves shift, but actually reading what those shifts mean on a graph. This is where students either earn big points on the AP exam or leave them on the table. We're going to make sure you're walking away with every tool you need. Visualizing the standard supply and demand graph. Picture a standard supply and demand diagram. You've got price on the vertical axis, always labeled P, and quantity on the horizontal axis, always labeled Q. Your downward-sloping demand curve and upward-sloping supply curve intersect at a single point. That intersection is your equilibrium, and you label it E1 with equilibrium price P1 and equilibrium quantity Q1. This isn't optional on the AP exam. College Board graders look for properly labeled axes, properly labeled curves, D and S. Not demand or supply spelled out is fine, but the labels must be there, and a clearly marked equilibrium point. If you skip labels, you lose points even if your logic is perfect. Consumer surplus and producer surplus. The triangle areas you must know. Here's where the graph becomes a story about who's winning. Consumer surplus is the area above the equilibrium price and below the demand curve. Think of it as the collective deal consumers are getting. If you were willing to pay $30 for a concert ticket but only paid $20, that $10 difference is your consumer surplus. On the graph, it forms a triangle above P1 and below the demand curve. Producer surplus is the mirror image, the area below the equilibrium price and above the supply curve. A vendor willing to sell for $15 but receiving 20 pockets $5 of producer surplus. The formula you need is beautifully simple for a triangle. area equals 1/2 times base times height. On an AP free response question, you might be given a linear supply and demand with specific numbers and asked to calculate surplus areas. For example, if equilibrium price is $20, the demand curve has a vertical intercept at $50. And equilibrium quantity is 100 units, then consumer surplus equals 1/2 times 100 times 50 minus 20 equals 1/2 times $100 times 30 equals $1,500. Practice setting this up because FRQ graders want to see your work laid out cleanly. Total surplus, also called social welfare or allocative efficiency, is simply consumer surplus plus producer surplus. At the free market equilibrium, total surplus is maximized. This is a foundational principle that connects directly to Unit 4 when you study market failures, price controls, and deadweight loss. Interpreting shifts, price, quantity, and surplus together. Now here's where students get tripped up. When a curve shifts, you can't just identify the new equilibrium. You have to narrate the whole story. Let's say demand increases. The demand curve shifts right to D2. Your new equilibrium moves to E2 with a higher price P2 and higher quantity Q2. On the AP exam, you must draw this precisely. Show D1 dashed or clearly labeled D2 as the new curve and a new intersection point marked E2. But what happens to surplus? This is the edge case that destroys MCQ scores. When demand increases and price rises, producers are selling more at a higher price. So producer surplus increases, that's intuitive, but consumer surplus? It gets tricky. The higher price actually shrinks the gap between willingness to pay and actual price for existing consumers. But more consumers are now participating in the market. The net effect on consumer surplus when demand increases is actually an increase because the gain from higher willingness to pay and greater quantity traded outweighs the loss from paying a higher price. College Board loves testing this, and students reflexively say, price went up, so consumer surplus went down. That's the trap. Don't fall for it. The demand curve itself shifted because consumers valued the good more, so their surplus grows. When supply increases, the supply curve shifts, right? Price falls and quantity rises. Consumer surplus unambiguously increases because consumers pay less for more units. Producer surplus has that same ambiguous feeling. But again, the net effect is an increase due to greater market participation. Both surpluses tend to rise when markets expand, which reinforces why economists generally favor policies that grow markets. The mechanics of simultaneous shifts. Double shift scenarios are an AP favorite. If both supply and demand increase simultaneously, quantity definitely rises, but the effect on price is indeterminate without knowing the relative magnitudes. If demand increases more than supply, price rises. If supply increases more, price falls. If they shift equally, price stays the same, but quantity rises. Your job on the exam is to recognize which case the question is describing, or to explicitly state the effect on price is indeterminate when you don't have enough information. And saying that earns you the point rather than losing it by guessing wrong. Calculating changes in equilibrium with equations. Some AP exam questions give you explicit supply and demand equations. A typical setup, QD equals 100 minus 2p and Qs equals 10 plus 3p. Set them equal to find equilibrium. 100 minus 2p equals 10 plus 3p, which gives you 90 equals 5p, so p times equals 18. Plug back in to get Q times equals 100 minus 2 times 18 equals 64. If demand then shifts to QD equals 120 minus 2p, repeat the process. 120 minus 2p equals 10 plus 3p gives 110 equals 5p, so p times equals 22 and q times equals 76. The exam wants you to recognize that equilibrium price and quantity both rose, consistent with an increase in demand, and your graph should match your algebra. Connections to price controls and deadweight loss. Everything you just learned lives inside Unit 3 and Unit 4 as well. Price ceilings set below equilibrium create shortages and reduce total surplus. The deadweight loss is a triangle of lost surplus that neither consumers nor producers capture. Price floors set above equilibrium create surpluses and similar deadweight loss triangles. When you're drawing those graphs, the deadweight loss triangle is always the area between the supply and demand curves, bounded by the controlled price and the quantities actually traded. Identifying that triangle precisely and calculating its area is a high-value FRQ skill. The AP exam checklist for this topic. Every time you draw a shift graph, ask yourself, did I label both axes? Did I label both curves, old and new? Did I mark E1 and E2? Did I identify what happened to price and quantity? And if surplus is asked, did I shade the triangle and show my area calculation? Checking these boxes is the difference between a 3 and a 5. With surplus areas, equilibrium math, and shift interpretation locked down, you're ready to apply this toolkit to some of the most consequential real-world situations in economics, starting with how government interventions like taxes and subsidies deliberately reshape these markets and redistribute surplus between consumers, producers, and the public.